On Christmas Eve, my younger sister accidentally discovered that my bank account held over $10 million. Just a few minutes later, my parents simultaneously demanded that I hand all of it over to her because they believed she deserved it more than I did. It might sound like a satirical scene from some low-budget film, but no, this was my real life. I am Evelyn Carter, 34 years old, living in Boston, Massachusetts. I never imagined that I would find myself sitting under the flickering lights of the Christmas tree, with the clinking of wine glasses and the smell of roasted turkey in the air, only to hear my own flesh and blood declare that the achievements of my entire life did not belong to me. I share this story not to boast about money, but to speak about a harsh reality that many people may recognize. There are families who will never see you as a person with dreams and efforts. To them, you are nothing more than an endless supply for their constant demands. Have you ever felt as though your family saw you as nothing but a walking bank account instead of a real human being? If you have, let me know where you are watching this from so I know I am not alone in this experience. I was born and raised in Boston, a harbor city filled with cold winds and salty mist. I was the eldest child in the family, and to be fair, my early years were not so bad. I was not overly spoiled, but I was not neglected either. My father took me to the park on weekend afternoons, my mother taught me to write my first letters at the kitchen table, and on my birthdays, they always remembered to buy me a small cake with a few candles. I once thought that although far from perfect, my family was at least normal. But then, one event changed everything. The birth of Chloe. She was born premature, when my mother was only 7 months pregnant, and I still remember that cold winter night, the phone ringing urgently, Aunt Linda appearing in her thick coat, urging me to get dressed quickly so we could rush to the hospital. In the mind of an 8-year-old child, everything felt blurry and chaotic, except for one thing that became painfully clear. From that moment on, I was no longer the center of this household. Chloe was tiny and fragile, kept inside an incubator for weeks. The doctors gave endless instructions, and my mother was nearly drained from worry. When Chloe was finally brought home, our 2-story apartment in the Boston suburbs instantly turned into a quarantine zone. The sharp smell of bleach lingered everywhere, bottles of disinfectant lined the shelves, and hand sanitizers appeared on every corner of the tables. My parents saw every germ as a hidden enemy, and sadly, in their eyes, I, a healthy 8-year-old, also became a potential source of infection. If I so much as sneezed, they would stuff clothes into my backpack and send me off to Aunt Linda's. If I coughed lightly, I was immediately shipped to Grandma Margaret's until I was considered safe again. At first, I found it amusing. At Aunt Linda's house, I could eat as many cookies as I wanted. At Grandma's, I listened to stories about the vintage jewelry she kept in an old wooden box. But that childish joy quickly faded as I slowly realized the truth. I wasn't being sent away to enjoy myself, I was being excluded. To my parents, every breath I took, every sneeze that escaped, meant a possible threat to their fragile newborn. The tension in our home grew heavier with each passing day. My mother scrubbed the floors until her hands cracked from the chemicals. My father established strict new rules. Before stepping into the living room, we had to change shoes and wash our hands in a basin of disinfectant. I can still remember the stench of bleach clinging to my blankets, haunting me even in my sleep. I used to crave being held in my mother's arms, but even when I ran to her, she would sidestep me, terrified that I might be carrying germs. I began to teach myself how to sit quietly in my room, doing everything I could to avoid attention, because if I so much as winced from a stomachache or muttered that I felt tired, the immediate response was always, "You'll have to stay at Aunt Linda's for a few days." The worst part was not being pushed aside, it was being forgotten in my own family's story. My parents began telling everyone that Evelyn was the strong and independent child, that I was the one who always understood and made sacrifices for her sister. But I didn't understand. I was just a child who couldn't figure out why a simple cold turned me into the unwanted one. I didn't understand why getting a perfect score in math didn't make my parents as happy as Chloe managing to sit upright for a few seconds without falling over. The only praise I ever received came in bland phrases like, "You're older now, you have to let your sister have her turn." From then on, an invisible wall rose between me and the rest of the family. Each time I saw my mother lean down, pressing her ear against Chloe's tiny chest to listen for her breathing, with my father standing beside her so anxious his eyes were rimmed with shadows, I felt both compassion and jealousy. I wanted to be seen with that same gaze, cared for with that same intensity, but it seemed that was something I would never have. So I began to find joy in other ways, through books, through drawing, and especially through listening to Grandma's stories about her world of antique jewelry. With her, I wasn't a potential threat. I was simply a curious, eager child. But imagine a child of 8 or 9, sitting alone in her room with the sting of bleach burning her nose, while laughter and applause erupted from the living room because Chloe had just babbled her very first sound. I understood that Chloe was fragile, that she needed protection. But what about me? I was their child too. I also needed to be held, to be praised. Yet from the moment Chloe arrived, the entire house cast its light on her, and all that remained for me were the cold, shadowed corners, where the smell of disinfectant became the most familiar thing in my world. That memory clung to me for years. I grew up in Chloe's shadow, and the gap between us only widened as time went on. I remember, in 4th grade, I entered the district science fair with a project I had built entirely on my own, a model of renewable energy powered by wind and water. I spent weeks tinkering in the garage, my hands sticky with glue, my hair smelling of burnt plastic. When I won first place, I raced home, thrilled, believing that this time my parents would finally smile at me. But when I handed the certificate to my mother, she only glanced at it before immediately turning back to check Chloe's temperature, though she only had a slight sniffle. My father, instead of congratulating me, warned me not to bring the display board into the house because the dust from the cardboard might trigger Chloe's allergies. My very first award, the pride of a child, was abandoned in the garage like a piece of trash. Meanwhile, just a few weeks later, Chloe sang shakily on stage at her school's talent show, her fragile voice earning a participation ribbon that nearly every student received. Yet the whole family went out to a restaurant, ordering expensive desserts to celebrate her big success. I still remember sitting there quietly, spooning ice cream into my mouth, wondering why her flimsy little certificate was worth more than my district-level prize. Slowly, I learned that no matter what I achieved, it would vanish into silence, while anything Chloe touched, no matter how small, was transformed into a reason for the family to cheer. I began to retreat into myself. After school, I no longer rushed to share my grades or activities. I would slip into my room, close the door, and seek peace in the world of books. I especially loved the ancient art volumes. The city library lent out thick yellowed pages filled with Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, and Roman pottery. Each time I turned a page, I felt as though I was stepping into another world, one where beauty and worth were recognized fairly, untouched by favoritism. In that small room, I allowed myself to dream that one day I could reach a larger world, one where effort would finally be rewarded as it should be. My greatest comfort was my grandmother, Margaret. She never treated me like a shadow. She had an old wooden box filled with vintage jewelry, necklaces strung with imitation pearls, rings set with glass stones, hairpins darkened by time. To others, they were nothing but cheap trinkets, but to me, they were treasures. She would sit beside me, letting me carefully wipe each piece clean, arrange them by size, and record notes in a small notebook. She told me stories about the jewelry trends of different eras, about how even a simple hairpin could reflect an entire period of history. Those stories not only fed my curiosity, they planted a quiet passion within me, to search for value in the things others dismissed as meaningless. The older I grew, the sharper the contrast became. When I performed Bridge Over Troubled Water at my high school piano recital, after months of practice, I hoped my parents would be there to cheer me on. But on the night of the performance, Chloe complained of a mild headache, and the entire family canceled their plans. I played on stage alone, looking out at a hall full of strangers' faces. 2 weeks later, When Chloe played Hot Cross Buns on the recorder in a 15-minute children's recital, the whole extended family crowded in, clapping wildly. I sat there forcing a smile, while inside my chest tightened. It wasn't that I didn't love my sister. There were times I truly felt sorry for her, recognizing that she was just a child who had learned to survive by leaning into the favoritism surrounding her. But compassion did not erase the pain. I tried everything to earn my parents' recognition, getting good grades, joining clubs, winning competitions, but all of it vanished into invisibility whenever placed beside Chloe's sneeze or her clumsy little performance. Slowly, I came to realize that in that house, I was nothing more than the backup, the one who existed to shoulder what she couldn't, and to disappear whenever she needed to shine. So I withdrew from the family stage, one I had never truly been allowed to stand on. I chose my own world, the pages of books, the old trinkets, the quiet afternoons spent with my grandmother, listening to the steady ticking of the clock in the living room and her slow explanations about each bracelet. She was the only one who praised my meticulousness, telling me that my eyes had the gift of spotting the smallest differences between what was real and what was fake. Those words, simple as they sounded, were worth more than any medal to a child who was constantly compared and overlooked. She planted the seed in me, a seed that would grow into the career of my lifetime. And so, as childhood slipped away, I gradually learned to accept the truth. I would never be the golden child, in my parents' eyes. But if I could not shine in that house, I would find a light of my own. I did not know what the future would bring, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never let my life be defined by the word leftover. In high school, I entered the stage many call the rebellious years, though for me it was not rebellion but a quiet breaking free. I knew I had no place at family dinners where every conversation revolved around Chloe, nor did I hope to see my certificates pinned on the refrigerator already plastered with her photos. So I threw myself into studying not to earn my parents' recognition, but to carve out an escape route for myself. I spent hours in the library, filling notebooks with precise mathematical concepts, devouring thick books on history and art. When you don't have anyone standing behind you to push, you learn to push yourself, and that made me determined to the point of stubbornness. Beyond studying, I joined nearly every club I could. The debate team, the school newspaper, the National Honor Society, even the art club. My schedule was packed, but I felt relieved, because at least at school I wasn't compared, I wasn't cast aside. On the debate stage, I learned to speak with clarity and confidence, to argue with logic sharp enough to leave opponents speechless. In the small newsroom of the school paper, I found joy in editing each article, arranging layouts neatly, just like I used to organize my grandmother's vintage jewelry. One achievement followed another, and soon I became a familiar face teachers praised. But once I returned home, everything dissolved like soap bubbles. I still remember the afternoon I received my SAT results. My hands trembled as I stared at the number, a perfect 1,600. I printed out the score report, rushed home, my heart racing with excitement. I thought, this time, surely they'll notice me. But when I held the paper out to my mother, she only whispered, "That's nice, but later, dear. Chloe's studying for her English test tomorrow, don't distract her." Chloe looked up and smirked. Some people have to work hard for their scores. Not everyone is just naturally gifted, you know, sis. My mother even chimed in, "Every child learns differently, don't make your sister feel pressured." And just like that, my perfect 1,600 was set aside, while Chloe's English test, marked with a mere 77, was proudly pinned to the refrigerator with a handwritten note. "We are proud of you." In that moment, I understood that any expectation I placed on my parents was useless. I decided I would no longer wait for their praise, I would let the world outside see me instead. I prepared my entire college application by myself, writing essays, requesting recommendation letters, filling out financial aid forms. I did it all alone, because I knew that if I mentioned it to my parents, they would only worry that Chloe might feel left out. I sent applications to top schools, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia. And when the acceptance letters began arriving one after another, my heart felt like it would burst with joy. But once again, that joy found no place in my family. The day I received my Harvard acceptance letter, everyone was gathered in the living room, eyes glued to Chloe in her brand new cheerleading uniform. She had just been picked as a reserve on the high school cheer squad, nothing more than a backup spot yet. My parents clapped and cheered as though she had won an Olympic medal. I stood there holding the crimson envelope stamped with Harvard's seal, wanting to share it, but slowly my hand dropped to my side. I knew exactly what would be said if I opened my mouth. "That's great, honey. You'll be fine on your own." Meanwhile, Chloe only had to wave her cheap pom-poms to be celebrated like a queen. So I chose Columbia University in New York, prestigious, and far enough away to finally sever the invisible chain binding me. I applied for a full scholarship and was fortunate enough to receive it. That night, I sat alone in my room, unfolding the letter as tears spilled down onto the bold word, "Congratulations." They were not tears of sadness, but of release. I had opened a door for myself out of that house, and out of the role of the forgotten child. The day before I left Boston, Grandma Margaret came to see me. She sat on the edge of my bed, holding my hand, her eyes glowing with pride in a way I had never once seen from my parents. Quietly, she handed me an envelope. Inside were $500 bills, money she had saved from her small pension. "Evelyn," she said, "I know you're going to make it. It isn't much, but I want you to have a good start. And remember, you don't need anyone's approval to have value. You only need to believe in yourself." I hugged her tightly, silently promising that I would never betray that faith. On the day I left, my parents claimed they were too busy taking Chloe to a cheerleading competition to see me off. It was Aunt Linda who drove me to the bus station, loading my suitcases onto the long-distance bus bound for New York. As the bus pulled away, I looked back at the familiar city of Boston, my heart caught between pain and relief. I knew that from that moment on, I had officially stepped out of the suffocating circle and into a journey of redefining myself. I arrived in New York on a late summer morning, the air humid, the smell of car exhaust mingling with the scent of bagels from street carts. The city was noisy, chaotic, but also bursting with opportunity, and I knew I had come to the right place to begin a new chapter. At Columbia, I chose a double major, art and business. Partly because of my love for the paintings and sculptures I had adored in books, but also because I understood if I only knew how to love beauty, I would remain a dreamer. But if I learned to manage it, I could transform my passion into a career. Long nights in the library found me immersed both in Botticelli's works and in dry finance textbooks. My classmates called me the one holding two worlds, but I didn't mind. I was already too used to carrying everything alone. To cover living expenses beyond my scholarship, I took a part-time job at a small auction house in Manhattan. It was an old building, the wooden stairs creaking with every step, the air filled with the scent of old paper and worn leather. At first, my tasks were simple: taking notes, arranging items, dusting off jewelry boxes. I remember one time spending hours sorting through hundreds of cheap rings for a weekend auction. Many would have found it boring work, but for me, every scratch and every tiny engraving whispered a story. I could forget to eat just from observing them under a magnifying glass, the way I once spent long afternoons with Grandma Margaret. Then came an unexpected opportunity. One winter day, I was assigned to sort through a box of jewelry labeled costume jewelry, supposedly fake decorative pieces. I opened the box and picked up an Art Deco hairpin. The moment I held it, I sensed something was off. It was heavier than typical imitations, and the clasp was crafted with an unbelievable precision. I secretly examined it under a magnifying glass and noticed a tiny, almost invisible mark engraved on the inner corner. My heart pounded. That night, I stayed late at the office, poring over books and online archives, and finally discovered that the mark matched a prestigious Parisian jewelry house from the 1922nd. In other words, what everyone thought was worthless imitation was in fact a rare piece potentially worth tens of thousands of dollars. Nervously, I presented my discovery to Mr. Harrison, my direct manager. At first, he didn't even bother to look up from his screen, waving me off with, "Sarah, These are all flea market trinkets, don't waste your time. I bit my lip, gathered every ounce of courage, and laid out the evidence I had prepared. Comparison photos, historical references, and detailed notes on the hallmark. I spoke with a steady voice, nothing like a timid student working part-time. At last, he paused his typing, looked directly at me, and for a moment his eyes flickered with surprise. "All right," he said slowly, "let me check again." A week later, the hairpin went up for auction. The starting price was only a few $100s, but once the collectors recognized the hallmark, the bidding war erupted. In the end, it sold for over $40,000. The auction room buzzed with excitement, while I sat quietly in the corner, my heart racing with both joy and disbelief. Harrison came over, shook my hand, and for the first time called me by the right name. "Evelyn, you have a rare eye. Don't waste it." In that moment, I knew I had just laid the first stone on the path of my own future. From that point on, he began to trust me more. Instead of sending smaller collections straight to the costume jewelry pile, he started letting me examine them first. I threw myself into the work with unrestrained passion. Every piece of jewelry felt like a mystery waiting to be solved, and I was the one hunting for clues. I learned how to distinguish the clarity of diamonds, how to read faint engravings, how to recognize the craftsmanship styles of different decades. I recorded everything in a thick notebook, which eventually became a reference guide for the entire team. That work not only sharpened my skills, but also gave me something rare, the feeling of being recognized. Unlike my parents, no one here cared who I was or compared me to Chloe. They only cared about results that I had uncovered value where they had overlooked it. I gradually became the secret eye of the auction house, the one who could see what others could not. Because of this, my college years unfolded differently. By day, I attended classes, taking diligent notes, striving to keep up with two demanding majors. By night, I sat in the small office of the auction house, my eyes straining under the warm yellow light as I studied each piece of jewelry as though it were the only world that mattered. I worked relentlessly, but I never felt exhausted because I knew I was inching closer to the person I wanted to become. When I graduated, I stood on stage receiving my diploma with the honor of summa cum laude, holding in my hand an official job offer from the auction house. My parents didn't attend, they were busy taking Chloe to some sporting event. But Grandma Margaret sent me a handwritten letter, her shaky script reading, "Evelyn, I am prouder of you than anything else in this world. Never let anyone make you believe you are invisible again." I held that letter, tears falling onto the page, and I swore I would make her blessing come true. I was no longer the child abandoned in the stench of bleach. I had found my own light, and it all began with an Art Deco hairpin mistakenly tossed into a box of fakes. After working at the auction house for several years, I began to feel an urge I had never dared entertain before. To open my own company. Why not? I had proven to myself and to the auction world that my eye never missed a detail. I had built credibility through discoveries no one else had noticed. But I also realized another truth. Within a large institution, I would always be the assistant, my achievements ultimately filed under someone else's name. I wanted out. I wanted to create something that bore my own mark, even knowing the path ahead would be riddled with risks. So I gathered all my savings, along with a small loan from the bank, and rented a tiny office in Brooklyn. In reality, it was just a second-floor room above a Chinese restaurant, with peeling paint on the walls, old drafty windows, and furniture I bought secondhand. The smell of takeout drifted up from the kitchen below, the air always laced with sweet and sour chicken and sesame oil. Friends who visited laughed and teased, "This is it? Your company's headquarters?" But I didn't care. Small and cramped as it was mine. It was my beginning. The first months were brutally hard. I sat up late into the night doing the books, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Clients were scarce, and the income wasn't enough to cover the office rent and the bank interest. Many nights I curled up on a cold metal chair, my heart pounding as if it might leap out of my chest, terrified that in just a few months I would have to shut down and be left with debts I had no idea how to manage. I kept taking small jobs authenticating a few $100 antiques for little shops or helping locals reappraise family heirlooms. The money I earned was meager, but I refused to quit. I believed that if I was patient enough, an opportunity would come. And that opportunity arrived on a bitter February morning. An antiques dealer in Manhattan, someone I had known from my auction house days, called to say a family had brought in an old collection of Victorian jewelry to sell, but they suspected a few pieces had uncertain provenance and wanted me to take a look. I could hardly believe my ears and accepted immediately. When the jewelry box was set in front of me, my heartbeat quickened. I opened each velvet tray and saw hundreds of pieces from dull gold hairpins and mottled pearl necklaces to stone-set rings already scratched and worn. Most of it looked like ordinary costume adornment at first glance, but I knew I had to be patient. I devoted 2 full weeks, practically living in the office, studying every detail, taking meticulous notes, and comparing them against hundreds of references in my notebook. And then, I found it. Buried among the seemingly ordinary pieces were 2 white gold hairpins etched with intricate patterns. The craftsmanship was too flawless to be replicas. I turned them over and over, holding them under the light, until I finally spotted the faint hallmark of a renowned 19th-century jeweler. These were rare works thought to have vanished through wars and displacements. If authentic, their value wasn't just a few thousand, it could reach tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. My hands trembled as I wrote the report, carefully choosing every word. When I handed it to the dealer, I saw his eyes light up. And just as I predicted, the 2 pieces were later auctioned successfully, bringing in an enormous sum for the family. My share was a 10% commission, $80,000 in total. It was the largest amount I had ever earned in my life, more than 2 years of salary combined at the auction house. I sat alone in my small office, listening to the clatter from the Chinese restaurant below, tears slipping down my face in equal parts joy and relief. That commission not only saved my fledgling company from the brink of collapse but also gave me a reputation. Word spread quickly. The young woman in Brooklyn, Evelyn Carter, had the eye to spot treasures others had overlooked. From then on, clients began seeking me out, lawyers representing heirs, private collectors, even major auction houses sending me trial contracts. I was no longer surviving on trinkets. I had truly stepped into a world where value was determined by sharp instincts and discerning eyes. Of course, the struggles weren't over. I still worked day and night authenticating, managing paperwork, learning to handle finances and clients. But there was one major difference. This time, I was no longer afraid. I knew I was on the right path. Whenever exhaustion crept in, I remembered my grandmother's words. You don't need anyone's approval to have value. And now, that very value had begun to be recognized by the world outside. In that cramped room infused with sesame oil and soy sauce, I realized my fragile dream was slowly becoming reality. When I held that first $80,000 commission in my hands, it felt as if the world had opened up. I reinvested almost immediately. I hired an assistant, purchased internationally certified appraisal equipment, and renovated the tiny Brooklyn office into a space professional enough to receive clients. From there, business grew so quickly that many times I could hardly believe it myself. People who had known me from the auction house began referring new clients, and eventually, the city's elite came knocking. They didn't want their names in the papers, they simply needed a trustworthy expert to authenticate their assets. And I became that person, a discreet presence, but irreplaceable. In just 3 years, I opened branches in Boston, then New York, and finally Chicago. The little Brooklyn office became more of a symbol than anything else, a reminder of those sleepless nights surrounded by the smell of sesame oil. Each time I cut the ribbon at a new opening, I would stand still for a few seconds, wondering if the little girl Evelyn, who was once sent to Aunt Linda's every time she sneezed, could have ever imagined this moment. My clients now were ancient, wealthy families, notorious collectors, even insurance corporations in need of valuation experts. I appeared in a few industry publications, quoted anonymously in financial magazines, but I continued to avoid public interviews. I didn't need the spotlight, I only needed credibility. And yet, in another world, I was still Evelyn, the eldest daughter running a little trinket shop. Every time I returned home for Sunday dinner, my mother introduced me to her friends with a tone half apologetic, half pitying. "This is my eldest daughter. She does little odd jobs with old jewelry. Not rich or anything, but she works hard." My father would add, "Yes, she doesn't make much, but she lives simply, frugally, and still manages to send money to help us." I would sit there, dressed in a discreet designer dress, a platinum credit card tucked inside my wallet, and simply smile. I was far too used to being diminished. The irony was that I really was sending them money. At first, it was $5,000 a month, later it increased to $7,000, all under the label of family support. I lied, telling them I lived frugally in New York, surviving on instant noodles and pinching every penny, and that the money I sent home came from the tiny job I was barely holding on to. My parents believed it completely. They told the neighbors I was the dutiful daughter, willing to struggle so the family could pay off debts, while in reality, every time I wired money, I was signing contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were nights when they sat around lamenting. Our poor eldest, living so hard yet still providing for this family. And I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. They had no idea that the very same morning I had authenticated a multi-million-dollar jewelry collection for a client in Dubai, earning a commission big enough to cover their mortgage for an entire year. But instead of feeling insulted, I found a kind of sweet irony in it. In their eyes, I was just the poor daughter sacrificing for her family, and perhaps that very misconception gave me a slice of freedom. They never asked too many questions, never cared what I actually did, they only cared about the steady stream of money flowing into their account. Alongside my outward success, I gradually built what I called a double life. By day, I was the CEO of a jewelry appraisal company with offices across 3 major cities, meeting with lawyers and financial advisors, signing 7-figure contracts. By night, whenever I returned to my parents' house for the holidays, I transformed into frugal Evelyn, listening to Chloe brag about her new designer bag from an outlet store while I wore an original Harry Winston necklace that no one noticed. More than once, I turned it into a game for myself. I would dress in a plain, modest outfit, then pin on a vintage brooch worth more than Chloe's car, sitting quietly as I watched them remain completely oblivious. I'm not sure if I kept that secret to protect myself or because there was a touch of wicked amusement in it. But the longer it went on, the more I realized I was living 2 lives. One was dazzling and hectic, where my name was whispered in private boardrooms. The other was quiet, where I was still dismissed as the eldest daughter running a trinket shop, yet I benefited from being underestimated. Between these 2 worlds, only Grandma Margaret knew a bit of the truth. She still visited me, still sat for hours helping me sort through files, her eyes shining with a pride I had never seen from anyone else in my family. I think that without her, I might have given up many times. It was her quiet faith in me that kept me steady in this double game. I didn't share all the numbers with her, but she knew I had succeeded, and she always reminded me, "You owe nothing to anyone but yourself. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words became the red thread I clung to, especially when I sat in my parents' kitchen, listening to them discuss which private MBA program Chloe should attend, before turning to ask if I could pitch in just a little more. To them, I was the poor one sacrificing. To the outside world, I was an irreplaceable expert. And I, caught between those 2 images, kept moving forward, half amused, half bitter, but never forgetting my goal. To protect what I had built with my own hands. That Christmas arrived in Boston's familiar chill, snow piled high along the streets like powdered sugar on a giant cake. My parents' house had always been known for hosting large parties every year, relatives from near and far, my parents' old friends, even neighbors they barely knew. But that year, I received a call from my mother in mid-December, her voice weak as she sighed. "I don't have the strength to cook for 30 people anymore. This year we'll just have to keep it simple, everyone can bring something." Her words caught in my throat. My mother's idea of simple meant dry turkey, bland boiled vegetables, and clumsy desserts politely praised by guests. For a fleeting moment, the The thought crossed my mind. If I stepped in to handle it, at least everyone would have a proper dinner. So I offered, "Let me handle it, Mom. I'll order catering. Everything will be taken care of." She hesitated. "But how can you afford that? Where would the money come from? Don't tell me you're taking out a loan." I swallowed a laugh. If only she knew that a single morning's work of mine could cover the entire event, but instead I just said, "Don't worry, I've been saving." I contacted an event company I often used for my VIP clients. They specialized in elegant parties, curated wines, and elaborate multi-course menus. I chose the very best slow-roasted beef ribs in red wine sauce, imported chocolate desserts, everything top tier. It would be a Christmas dinner to remember, not just for the food. On Christmas Eve, the house glowed with sparkling lights, the tall tree decorated with red baubles, candles shimmering across the table. When the catering team delivered the meal, the entire room filled with a rich, luxurious aroma, nothing like the cold scent of bleach that haunted my childhood. Guests marveled, and my mother, half embarrassed and half proud, boasted that her eldest daughter had managed to book this service. I sat quietly, smiling, unwilling to break their illusion that I was the frugal child who had scraped and saved to please the family. Chloe, of course, sneered. She probably went into debt just to show off. I didn't reply. I just poured more wine for the guests. Near the end of the evening, I slipped away to my old room upstairs. My mother had left it untouched since I was 16, the wallpaper faded, the bookshelf still holding a few Nancy Drew novels I once devoured. I opened my laptop and logged in to monitor a live auction in Europe. A rare Art Nouveau necklace was being fiercely contested. The numbers jumped rapidly, hundreds of thousands of dollars in mere minutes. I focused intently, ready to confirm the bid if my client secured the prize. The door burst open without a knock. Chloe walked in, phone and broken charger in hand, sighing, "Do you have a spare charger?" Before I could react, her eyes fell straight onto my laptop screen. The numbers were unmistakable. The company account showing an 8-figure balance, multi-million-dollar contracts, quarterly profit reports. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, as if she had just stumbled upon buried treasure. For a split second, I thought about slamming the laptop shut, but it was too late. Chloe smirked. "Oh, so you're not as poor as we thought." Before I could say a word, she grabbed the laptop and bolted down the stairs. My heart pounded as I chased after her, but I was too late. Chloe strode into the living room where more than 20 pairs of eyes turned toward us. She set the laptop on the table, spun the screen around, and shrieked, "Everyone should see this. Our Evelyn's been hiding something." The room fell into silence. Christmas carols still floated from the small speakers, but they seemed distant, hollow. On the screen, the figures glared back: an account balance of over $10 million, a $500,000 contract pending, quarterly reports worth millions more. Guests gasped. I stood frozen, sweat beading at my temples. My mother was the first to break the silence. She burst out laughing, but the sound quickly twisted into a bitter, angry cackle. "Nonsense, that can't be real. My daughter just tinkers with old jewelry in a little shop." But when she realized there was no way to deny the numbers flashing before her, her face turned crimson. She shot to her feet, pointing at me, her voice trembling with fury. "You've had $10 million while we struggled to pay debts? Your sister needed money for school, and you just sat there doing nothing? Chloe deserves it more than you ever will. You need to give her that money." The room erupted in whispers. Aunts shook their heads, uncles murmured to one another. Chloe clutched her chest and broke into sobs. "I trusted you, I confided in you, and you hid this from us. I'm the one who deserves it. You've betrayed the family." My father slammed his hand against the table, his voice sharp and commanding. "Who do you think you are? We raised you. Now it's time you repaid us. All." I stood there, feeling as if my entire childhood had collapsed onto this single moment. Every time I had been pushed aside, every certificate left to gather dust in the garage. Every night I played piano in an empty auditorium, all of it surged back in the accusations of the very people I called family. I looked around the glittering room, where guests now saw me as nothing more than a walking wallet. And I understood, in that painful instant, the raw truth. I was no longer the forgotten child. I was the child expected to sacrifice everything, even my own life, to preserve their illusion of a golden daughter. The room, once filled with the scent of Christmas, had transformed into a stage for tragedy. My mother's face burned red, her shrill voice cutting through the air. You have millions of dollars while your parents scrape to pay for medicine and utilities? While your sister is preparing for her MBA at a prestigious school, you sit on all that money? You must give it to her. Chloe is the one who deserves it. The chatter of guests died away, leaving only the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. My father cut in, his expression cold, his voice heavy with false authority. We raised you, fed you, educated you. Now it's time to repay that debt. Don't think just because you have 10 million in the bank that you can deny what we've done for you. He spoke as if the years I had spent scraping together scholarship applications, financial aid forms, and part-time jobs to support myself had never even existed. Chloe burst into sobs, mascara streaking down her cheeks, clutching her chest as if I had dealt her the deepest betrayal. She wailed, I trusted you, I always trusted you, and yet you hid everything from me. You betrayed me, you betrayed this family. I'm the one who deserves that money. I'm the one who needs it to build a future. You already have more than enough. Every word was like a knife twisting into old scars, tearing open wounds from childhood that had never fully healed. For a few seconds, I stood frozen. Around me, faces hardened with judgment, as if I were standing trial and they were the jury. And then, something inside me snapped. My forgotten childhood, the nights I studied alone, the awards thrown into the garage, the empty auditoriums where I played piano, the monthly checks I sent to keep their lives afloat without a single thank you, all of it surged through me like fire. My voice rang out, trembling but unyielding. Repay you? Did you really raise me? Or did you send me away every time I sneezed, as if I were a threat to your golden child? Do you remember ever sitting in the hall when I won first place in science, or when I played piano at a recital? No. You were busy taking Chloe to blow on a recorder, to wave pom-poms, busy praising a C grade as if it were a Nobel Prize. I have carried myself every step of the way. When I got into college, who sat with me filling out applications? When I worked part-time to pay my own bills, who cared? No one. I've been supporting you for years, 5,000, then 7,000 a month just to keep this house from crumbling. And now, instead of congratulations, all I hear are demands. Have you ever truly seen me as your daughter? The room fell silent. A few guests lowered their eyes in embarrassment, some coughed quietly, avoiding my gaze. But my mother only screamed louder, her voice choked with anger. You always make yourself the victim. We've done everything for you, and now you stand there parading your so-called sacrifices? Yes, you have money, but you're selfish. Chloe is the one who thinks of family. You only think of yourself. My father nodded, his eyes blazing. That's right, without us, you'd be nothing. Chloe kept sobbing, her crocodile tears splashing onto the dinner table, drawing sympathetic pats on the shoulder from a few gullible guests. I took a deep breath, realizing there was nothing left to say. Any explanation would only be twisted. I shut the laptop, slipped it into my bag, and picked up my Hermes purse, the same one my mother once dismissed as a knockoff that looks decent enough. I slung it over my shoulder, lifted my head, and met my parents' eyes with a voice calm enough to cut. If to you I'm nothing but a wallet, then remember this wallet is closed. From this moment on, I owe nothing to people who only demand and never appreciate. No one moved. I turned and walked out of that glittering room, which had suddenly become suffocating. The steady strike of my heels on the wooden floor drowned out Chloe's wailing and my mother's furious shouts behind me. As the door closed and the icy Boston air rushed in, I found myself breathing easier than I had at any point during that dinner. Inside, they were probably still arguing, plotting how to divide my money as if I had died and left an estate behind. But I no longer cared. That Christmas night, I left behind not only a chaotic dinner, but also a family that had turned its back on me long ago. And this time, I did not look back. I left that Christmas dinner in a cold so sharp it burned my skin, but I hadn't even made it home before my phone started buzzing nonstop. When I looked, there were more than 20 missed calls, most from my mother and Chloe. The messages began flooding in. "You can't just walk out like that. We need to talk, don't make things worse. You owe this family, don't forget it." That night, I turned my phone off, but by the next morning, when I switched it back on, the number of messages had passed 100. Even distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly felt the need to weigh in. An aunt in California wrote, "Evelyn, family comes first. Money means nothing if it costs you your kin." An uncle I hadn't spoken to since I was 10 called out of the blue, his tone pompous, "You have to share, family doesn't keep score." I laughed bitterly. So, the moment rumors of $10 million spread, everyone seemed to believe they had a right to pass judgment. Chloe, of course, chose a different route: social media. The very next evening, she posted a long message on Facebook, attaching photos from the dinner with a caption. "Some people in the family are filthy rich yet still let their parents struggle with debt, still force their little sister to fight for scholarships. It's heartbreaking to discover such betrayal on Christmas night." The post spread like wildfire. Old high school classmates I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in with comments, "So disappointing. I thought Evelyn was kind-hearted." Some people even sent direct messages attacking me. "You're selfish. Don't you feel ashamed?" I read a few lines, then quietly deactivated my account. Not because I felt shame, but because I knew arguing online would only turn me into a spectacle. A week later, before the storm on social media had even settled, the chaos found its way to my workplace. On Monday morning, I walked into the Boston headquarters, our sleek glass building on the main avenue, when the receptionist called urgently over the intercom. "Miss Carter, 3 visitors are here. They say they're your family. They're waiting in the lobby." A chill ran down my spine, but I went forward, and the sight froze me in place. My mother, father, and Chloe were already seated on the sofa, their expressions taut, as if they were attending some high-stakes business meeting. Chloe clutched her Michael Kors bag tightly, her eyes red but glittering with calculation. "We've discussed it," my father began, his voice solemn. "And we believe you should establish a trust fund for the family. Your mother and I need a vacation home in Florida for retirement. Chloe needs at least $2 million to launch her career and pursue her MBA. That would be the fairest arrangement." My mother nodded firmly, adding, "You have $10 million. Giving away a few million won't leave you lacking. This is responsibility. This is your duty as a daughter." Chloe curled her lip and chimed in, "If you really cared about me, you wouldn't hesitate. I deserve this opportunity." I stood there, cold inside. Their words weren't a request, they were a command. They had walked into my company's headquarters as if it were their personal bank, and I was just the cashier. I took a deep breath, met their eyes, and said clearly, "You've made one mistake. This isn't our money, this is my work. I sent money every month for years, thinking it was at least support for my parents. But if all you see in me is a wallet, then the game ends today." Right there in the lobby, I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and in front of them canceled the standing monthly transfer. "From now on, not a single dollar more," I said, my eyes unblinking. My mother's jaw dropped, as if she had just witnessed a crime. My father's face flushed red, his mouth opening to roar, but 2 security guards had already stepped forward at my signal. "Please escort the guests out of the building," one said, polite yet firm. Chloe thrashed and sobbed, "You're cruel. You'll regret this." But she too was guided away. The image of the 3 of them, my father, my mother, and my sister, being led out of the building while my employees looked on with wide-eyed curiosity, seared itself into my memory as a point of no return. Of course, it didn't end there. In the days that followed, I received a flood of emails, calls from unknown numbers, anonymous messages, all repeating the same refrain. "Family is everything. you should share. I knew immediately that my parents and Chloe had enlisted relatives and acquaintances to pressure me. I didn't respond to a single one. Instead, I called my lawyer and laid out the entire situation. He listened quietly, then after a pause, said, "We'll send a cease and desist. This behavior could be considered harassment, even extortion. You don't have to endure this any longer." A week later, the legal letter was delivered directly to my parents with a clear warning. If they continued contacting me to demand money, they could be taken to court, facing consequences that would threaten both their reputation and their assets. From that day forward, my phone fell into an unfamiliar silence. No more demanding texts, no more late-night calls. Instead, I heard through acquaintances that my parents and Chloe had begun spinning a different story. That they had never wanted my money. That they were praying for me to be saved after I had supposedly been blinded by wealth. I didn't argue. They could say whatever they wanted, as long as they left me alone. That Christmas closed with the slam of a door, and behind it stretched a long, unbroken silence. But in that silence, I felt lighter than I ever had. I had cut the invisible chain that had bound me for decades. My family had turned away, my relatives whispered, and social media passed judgment, but none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that, for the first time in my life, I knew I owed nothing to anyone. 6 months after that fateful Christmas Eve, my life had shifted into a new chapter. I left my small apartment in Back Bay and moved into a penthouse by the Boston Harbor, where floor-to-ceiling glass opened onto a skyline glittering with lights. Every night, the sound of waves hitting the docks played like a private symphony just for me. I hired a professional security team to install access controls, smart cameras, and even a custom-built wall safe to protect the rare collections entrusted to me by clients. This space was more than a home, it was a fortress, proof that I had built a life with my own hands. The company grew beyond anything I had imagined. Our 3 offices in Boston, New York, and Chicago thrummed with activity, staff doubling in just 1 quarter. I spent countless hours on planes, signing contracts with insurance corporations, advising private collectors, and beginning to expand services into Europe. Financial publications mentioned me more frequently, though always as an unnamed expert. I didn't need the public to know my face, only that the elite understood one truth. If they wanted precise appraisal, there was only one name to seek. As for my family, they were utterly silent. After the lawyer's warning, the calls stopped, the texts stopped, the surprise appearances at my office stopped. That silence was both a release and a wound. I no longer had to hear their reproaches, but I also knew that the thread called family had snapped for good. In that picture, only Grandma Margaret remained as a warm color. She still visited me every weekend, bringing buttery pastries and her sparkling eyes. We sat together at the long glass table in the penthouse living room, the afternoon sun streaming across the surface, sorting through the latest jewelry I had brought back from New York. She turned each piece slowly beneath the magnifying lens, her hands trembling but her gaze still sharp. "You were born to do this," she would often whisper. In those moments, I became once more the little girl sitting beside her with a wooden jewelry box, and for the first time, my entire life circle felt complete. Chloe, however, still refused to let go. On Facebook, she kept spinning the victim's tale. My sister abandoned the family, caring only about money, while I'm left to bear the consequences. For a while, her posts still drew a few dozen shares and sympathetic comments. But like every other online scandal, the attention faded. Her friends grew tired. No one wanted to hear the same refrain forever. The image of the poor little sister withered, leaving only emptiness as even her followers began to turn away. I heard she was still drifting from one short-term job to another, sometimes marketing, sometimes retail fashion, none of it leading anywhere. I no longer felt anger, only emptiness. Perhaps her failures no longer had anything to do with me. For me, a different journey began. Therapy. I met with a counselor every week, sitting in a softly lit room, recounting fragments of memories I had long tried to bury, the stench of bleach that haunted my childhood, the times I was forgotten at recitals, The way my mother sidestepped when I ran toward her arms. At first, I cried often, sometimes until I couldn't breathe. But slowly, I learned that those emotions weren't weakness. They were my body releasing wounds that had been caged too long. I learned to set boundaries, to say no without guilt, to acknowledge that I had done enough, and that I owed no one anything more. For the first time in my life, I felt I was living honestly, not as the leftover child, not as the family's wallet, but as a human being with value of her own. And then Christmas came again. I stood in my penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, the colored lights reflecting across the dark water. On the large wooden table, I placed a vintage silver necklace, the gift my grandmother had given me years ago. It wasn't worth nearly as much as the pieces I appraised every day, but to me, it was priceless. It was the symbol of the rare love I had ever received from blood family. I sat down, watching the necklace sparkle under the warm glow of the lamp, and remembered everything. The days I was pushed aside, the moment I stood up to face my entire family, and the steps I took walking away without turning back. I turned, looking directly into the camera, or rather, into the eyes of those listening to this story, and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. Money cannot buy family, but true family will never reduce you to a wallet. If your family doesn't respect you, if they only demand and never see you as a person, then have the courage to draw your boundaries. Remember, you can choose your own family, the ones who value you, who lift you up, and who love you for who you truly are. Outside, the waves kept breaking against the shore, the city lights continued to blaze, and for the first time in my life, I felt as calm as a still, unbroken sea.